Hello, I am Mike Tatarski, creator of the Vietnam Weekly newsletter and host of the Vietnam Weekly podcast, here with the first full episode of the relaunched show. I hope everyone who celebrated Tet had a wonderful holiday break. My first guest is Michael Brosowski, founder and strategic director of the Blue Dragon Children's Foundation, a charity doing some of the best and most important work in Vietnam. I'll start with a caveat that this episode has some pretty disturbing subject matter. Michael's organization does work that is very difficult, very challenging, but very important. So we talked about Blue Dragon's work over the last few years, the rise of scam compounds in Southeast Asia, starting particularly in Cambodia and then spreading to Myanmar and Laos, the impact of the ongoing civil war in Myanmar and how that has led to some new vectors and drivers of human trafficking in Southeast Asia, how his team has had to adjust to providing support for male survivors of human trafficking after being rescued, and other topics beyond that. And I've included a link to how you can support Blue Dragon in the show notes, so I hope you find this as interesting as I did. Michael, thanks for joining me today.
Mike, it is great to be talking to you again.
Yeah, how are things up in Hanoi?
Keeping busy. I can never complain about boredom, but it's great. They're making great progress dealing with lots of issues.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean that's what we're here to talk about. So I think you were my first guest on the podcast back during the pandemic. So that was mid 2021. Obviously, COVID-19 was kind of the primary concern across everybody, including Blue Dragon's work. So, how has your work evolved in the 2.5 years since then?
Wow, so much has happened. During COVID, Blue Dragon went through a period of having to really quite shift our direction very quickly to from dealing with the sort of the long-term issues that we're grappling with. How to end human trafficking, how to keep kids safe. Our work really became focused for a while there on just how to get food and money to people who were in desperate situations. So of course, since then, things have kind of righted themselves, and we're not just delivering food out on the streets anymore as we were for a while. But there are such new forms of trafficking that have emerged, partly because of COVID, and certainly since COVID. The whole landscape that we're dealing with now is very, very different. So once again, Blue Dragon has had to reinvent ourselves to be where we're needed.
Yeah, and that's part of what I wanted to talk about today. I know, or at least my understanding, correct me if I'm wrong, is traditionally your focus has kind of been on China, or Vietnamese people, women in particular, I suppose, being trafficked into China. And I know from reading your Blue Dragons updates that Myanmar has emerged as an area of concern, but we can get to that. But what kind of new trends or patterns have you had to adjust to?
Well, yeah, you're quite right that in the past we were dealing mostly with the issue of bride trafficking. And I should say that even before we were dealing with bride trafficking, we were dealing with the trafficking of children into sweatshops. So there have been shifts over time in where our attention has been called to. This shift has been sudden, and it's to scam centers, online forced scamming centers in Myanmar, but also in Cambodia, which is more where they started, and even in Laos. Um, so, a type of trafficking that affects people quite differently, that operates a bit differently. We've really had to learn on the run once again.
Right. Yeah. I mean, these scam compounds, I'm sure a lot of listeners will have at least come across something about this. There's been pretty prominent international coverage over the last couple of years, and a lot of great, I should say, regional reporting from journalists in the region as well, especially in Cambodia. So,
Mm.
where have these come from and why?
Well, sometimes it's easier looking back, working out how it's happened, but I think we're already in a position where we can kind of see now what happened. So when COVID hit, a few factors kind of emerged all at once. First of all, some governments, like China, really took things seriously, and Vietnam did as well, and really managed border crossings and migration to keep people safe. So that made life a lot harder for anyone who wanted to traffic people into China. So that was one thing. And then over there in Cambodia, especially in Sihanoukville, there were a lot of, some were half built and some completed casinos that, you know, various gangsters were planning to make lots of money from. And all of a sudden they couldn't have any customers because people couldn't travel there.
Hmm.
And so those gangsters in Cambodia uh, pivoted, as we all did, and said, "Well, how can we make money anyway?" And so they took their concept online, so you could gamble from anywhere in the world, and they wanted to have uh, people running those places, workers who could speak various languages, so that you could be gambling from Vietnam, from China, from wherever. They then took that a step further and said, well, what if we traffic the people in? What if we make them work without payment? And so this model went from uh, in-person casinos to online casinos to casinos that uh, uh, are operating on slave labor, and the model kept developing. Soon it was also, what if it's not just gambling but also scamming people online? What if we have brothels attached to these places? The model kept developing and making millions and millions of dollars. So what started as a few gangsters saying, well, why don't we give this a shot, quickly turned into a massively profitable model that others then started to replicate and spread out to different parts around the region and are now massively successful
Hmm.
and kind of embedded, unfortunately.
Yeah. So how? I mean, again, you said you've had Blue Dragon has a lot of experience with bride trafficking, so I'm sure kind of the drivers and push and pull of that is fairly well understood on your end, at least. But these gangsters, these people running these scam compounds, how do they draw people in?
Well, one of the sad ironies here is that a lot of the people who are involved in tricking others to um, to come to the centres, thinking that they're on their way to a job, the people who are doing that may themselves be victims of human trafficking.
Hmm.
So basically, you have people who are online using often fake social media profiles, pretending that they've got jobs, pretending that they're successful business people, or joining online recruitment discussions. And the conversation is always, "Hey, I'm in Cambodia," or sometimes they will say that they're in Vietnam and just lure people to a spot near the border and then take them across, maybe without them even knowing.
Hmm.
But they're offering jobs, and they always appear very legitimate. I know of people who, they were in contact with these recruiters for weeks or for months. The recruiter may have even sent money to them to help them to get to the border. They may even do things like reference checks and and ask people to join an interview. So it all seems like a real job. And who are the people falling victim to this? Well, they're all the people who lost their jobs because of COVID, when factories shut down, tourism ground to a halt. And even though COVID is long over our shoulder in the rearview mirror now, the closures anyway, not the illness, but the closures, um, the impacts of it are still being felt in this region. That's why Vietnam's economy has been so slow, because globally there's less demand for manufacturing. Um, so the ripple effect continues, and people are still desperate for jobs.
Hmm.
And here you have these gangsters running these scam centers and fake casinos, tricking them, luring them in, and often forcing other trafficked people to do that luring in of new victims.
Yeah, and I know there's been some fairly dramatic incidents related to these. I think it's probably been at least a year now, but where in the Mekong Delta, a group of Vietnamese men swam across a river trying to escape a compound. What does Blue Dragon do on this area?
Well, we're receiving calls for help from families of people who are in those centres, and sometimes we're talking directly to people ourselves. as always, Mike, when I talk about our human trafficking rescue operations, I have to get a little bit vague so
Of
that
course, yeah.
I don't give the game away. But I can say that these operations are particularly difficult because these compounds are guarded by men with guns.
Mm.
And in Cambodia, there's reason to believe that the police might be involved.
Hmm.
In Myanmar, there are certainly various militias, and I mean, there's a whole war raging in northern Myanmar at the moment, where these centres are based. So even though we know very often where people are, it might not be possible to get to them in the short term. Um, and so we often have to wait for a particular moment. But we have been able to get some people out and get them back. Um, and their reports of what's happening to them are really quite frightening.
Mm.
You know, you might think, well, sex trafficking into forced marriage or to brothel, that's that's going to be absolutely terrible, and forced labor will be less terrible. But I can tell you that they're both violent and brutal.
Hmm.
Um, we're hearing reports and seeing the evidence of people being physically tortured with stun guns. Um, the traffickers will do things like they'll strip their victims naked and take photographs of them and tell them, if you don't perform, if you don't obey, these photos are going to every one of your friends and family on social media. Um, Out of Myanmar, there are reports of people having their organs taken as a punishment for not doing well. And with all of this, I never want to dramatize human trafficking because
Sure.
it's terrible enough without NGOs adding to the stories and the mythology.
Hmm.
But we've seen enough to be concerned that it's happening. We've rescued some people who have had their organs removed, and others who luckily were able to escape before it happened, but their traffickers told them that that's where they were headed. So, you know, this is horrifying stuff, as horrifying as any kind of slavery can be.
Sticking with Cambodia for a second, I believe I've read that Blue Dragon is kind of expanding its work in southern Vietnam. I mean, again, in the past with focus on China, the North would, of course, be a hotspot for that. So, is this in response to the situation in Cambodia, or is there something else driving that?
Ah, but in fact, the people who we rescue, whether they're no matter where we rescue them from, they can be from anywhere. So
Hmm.
we've rescued lots of people uh, from slavery in northern areas who are from southern areas. Um, People who are being trafficked to Cambodia, some of them are from Hanoi.
Hmm.
So distance doesn't matter to the traffickers. In fact, sometimes they prefer to take people from far away because it makes it harder for their families to go looking for them.
Hmm.
So if someone's being trafficked to Cambodia, the trafficker might prefer that they're not from Ho Chi Minh City,
Hmm.
um, because the distance is quite small.
Right.
They prefer to get people where they know it's going to be hard for someone to investigate, and perhaps the police from northern Vietnam, for example, have less of a network with
Hmm.
border guards and police down in the south. So the issue with us doing a bit more into in the southern regions, in Ho Chi Minh City and in Bạc Liêu province, that's actually more about our overall vision of ending human trafficking altogether in Vietnam, whereby we're developing a model of what activities work, what interventions really make a difference, and we're trying those out in different parts of the country. And we need to do that north, central, and south
Hmm.
to really get that body of evidence.
Speaking of methods or interventions, I know, or I believe at least when it comes to rescuing women from China, Blue Dragon provides support after the fact. You know, surely these women are traumatized, especially if they've been there for years or decades even. How has this changed? Because I understand it with these scam compounds, there's a lot of men also being lured into these places. So how does your response to more men, I guess, male victims, perhaps. How do you work with that?
Good question, because working with male survivors of human trafficking and slavery is different. A key difference is that men men tend to see themselves more as the strong provider, and
Mm-hmm.
so being trafficked and enslaved and then being rescued or escaping with nothing in their hand um, is more a matter of shame in different ways than it is for women.
Mm-hmm.
So men often don't want to accept the same level of support that women will accept, even though they actually need it just as
Mm-hmm.
much. Men typically don't want to go and live in a shelter, or they don't want to stay in a shelter. They want to go home to their family, or they want to be more independently, like in a guest house or some alternative arrangement. Uh, Men don't necessarily want to access vocational training. Women are more likely to say that they'd like training. Men want to get straight into a job. Um, so there are those very practical differences, as well as different needs for men as for women when it comes to psychological counselling. So Blue
Mm-hmm.
Dragon has we've added a male psychologist to our team, so that we have a man able to work with other men, and we're looking at all those uh, how do we provide accommodation for people who don't want to stay in a shelter? How do we get people onto a good long-term path
Mm-hmm.
for those who don't want to invest time in training? Yeah, it's quite different, but a good challenge for us because uh, we need to acknowledge that yes, males are trafficked as well as females, and so Blue Dragon has now expanded our services to cater for that.
We have mentioned bride trafficking a couple times as all of these other trends are emerging. Is that still a major issue as well? There's been a lot of coverage and discussion lately of China's own economic downturn, hopefully temporary. And obviously, China has a really big, widely covered now demographic issue with declining birth rates and gender imbalances. Vietnam has that too, to a lesser degree. But is that still an issue you focus on as well?
Well, we still rescue anyone who calls for help,
Yeah.
and even if now all bride trafficking completely stopped forever, there are still people in
Mm.
slavery. Recently, we rescued a 55-year-old woman who was trafficked 28 years ago into
Wow.
being a forced bride.
Hmm.
But it's now a much smaller part of our work. Uh, and there's a few reasons, a few different things have happened all at once. One is that these other types of trafficking have arisen, and they tend to be more profitable for the
Mm.
traffickers because when you sell a bride, you can sell her only one time. You traffic someone into a scam compound or into a brothel, and you can keep making money from them for months and months and months and years. So that's happened. But also, again, going back to what happened during COVID, where the Chinese police they stepped up their community surveillance and understanding who was in their community, and and so that has made things so much harder
Mm.
for the traffickers. Both Vietnam and China, by the way, are they're good case studies in what strong governments can do
Hmm.
to stop crime. These scam compounds, you don't see them popping up in Vietnam.
Right.
I believe there have been a couple, and they've just been shut down immediately. They haven't
Hmm.
they haven't even gained traction. We're not hearing about them at all in China. They're popping up where law enforcement is really weak. Um, Myanmar and Cambodia in particular. So both Vietnam and China seem to be grappling with this problem and doing their best to prevent trafficking and intervene when it happens. And this seems to mean that the traffickers are moving towards places where they've got more free reign, where they
Hmm.
feel confident that no one's going to stop them.
Yeah, I mean, the scale of it in Cambodia, at least from the reporting available, is just staggering. I know there's a lot of terrible stuff going on in the world, but even in this day and age, kind of stunning that that would be going on so openly, seemingly.
Yeah, there's a figure from the UNODC that there may be about 120,000 people in Cambodia alone
Mm.
in these scam centers. Now that's, plus other forms of trafficking
Hmm.
that Cambodia has to deal with. So that's huge, and another 100,000 in Myanmar. So it shows you, how madly profitable this business has become in a very short time. And if you think back that 2.5 years ago, this particular form of trafficking didn't even really exist.
Right.
And now there's 120,000 people in Cambodia. That's quite unprecedented. Um, and yes, it is very hard at the moment. There are so many problems in our world. Um, what's happening in Gaza and Israel, what's happening in Ukraine and Russia, um, that it's hard for the world perhaps to see this problem as being so severe. But when you look at the scale, it's deeply worrying and something we need to take action on.
Which brings us to Myanmar. And this is a Vietnam-focused podcast and newsletter, but the region is important. And on speaking of topics that are maybe don't get the attention they warrant, Myanmar, the situation has been just horrible for several years now. I assume most listeners know this, but run by a military junta that took power a few years back. And basically, kind of a multifaceted civil war is underway with, I believe, parts of the country are just not even under government control, which has kind of created these various zones where legal enforcement is poor, I guess, to put it mildly. But anyway, so you just said that there's estimated 100,000 people in scam compounds in Myanmar, and I know in the past few weeks there's been some domestic reporting here in Vietnam that the Vietnamese government has brought back a few hundred Vietnamese that were, I suppose, trafficked there or trapped there at least. But so I know this has kind of come on the radar quickly. But again, what have you been saying with Blue Dragon? And again, I know you can't give specifics on how you bring people back, but what are you seeing?
Again, it's a messy and complex situation, which is how this human trafficking actually is able to get a foothold and then thrive. So the people who the Vietnamese government has brought back, and I believe there's 1,000 or more. Some may have been trafficked, and some were people working there.
Mm.
The challenge is, how do you get 1,000 people from northern Myanmar to Vietnam? The two countries don't share a border,
Mm-hmm.
and so it's been really hard. And I know that behind the scenes, the Vietnamese government has really been working on that, much to their credit. But it's a massive problem, and there's still a lot of people in need of help. We're getting calls from people who are in these scam compounds, and they're using their telephone to live stream or to video fighter jets and helicopters flying overhead,
Mm.
firing rockets and dropping bombs. We've seen photos and film of fighting that's going on, of people dead in the streets. So, in a situation of so much uncertainty and violence, um, people who are in slavery, they're even afraid to escape now.
Mm-hmm.
Stay where they are in slavery, get beaten, maybe have their organs removed, or try to run out into the streets and maybe get shot. And one woman who we brought home some time ago, she came home with a bullet in her lung,
Mm.
and had to have it removed. It's a real threat. People really feel terrified that they're in a no-win situation.
I mean, on the organ harvesting, which is just about one of the darkest things you can think of. And if people don't want to hear this, I don't blame them, but it is important. I know you're not one to traffic in hyperbole, not to overuse the word traffic there. But why would that be done? What leads to something like that?
Again, it's like an extension of the money making factory that these traffickers have set up. So for a long time, if somebody didn't work well, if somebody wasn't meeting targets, or if they were in a brothel and they refused to serve any men, they'd be beaten and tortured. And then obviously someone has come up with a thought, well, instead of torturing them, why don't we just take their body parts? And so we've been in contact with people, we've spoken with people who have said that they were given a choice, or they've seen other people given a choice. We can either torture you at this point because you haven't been doing well, or you can give us your kidney. And people have to make that choice.
Mhm.
Now, that's where it gets kind of difficult. And so, to be really honest, some of this I cannot verify, but we have heard stories of large numbers of people, like in the dozens and hundreds, going off to have organs removed and not returning or not being seen again.
Mhm.
The highest figure that I've heard was of a group of 600 people. But again, I can't verify that.
Mhm.
What I think it all does point to, though, without dispute, is that someone there has found a way to harvest organs and sell them. We have no idea where they are selling them to. And the one hope I have for this is that because it's a war region right now, a war zone, that I'm hoping it means that organ traffickers can't do very much work. It's not that easy to take out someone's organ and put it in someone else.
Mhm.
You probably need to transport it to another area, or have good functioning hospitals.
Mhm.
So my hope here is that the impact of this war is to reduce the ability of the organ traffickers.
Mm. That was a rather grim silver lining, but perhaps. So again, we've had these kind of emerging Cambodia, Myanmar, Laos, I believe, as well, has some issues with
Yeah.
scam compounds. So kind of looking forward through the rest of this year, where do you see, obviously, continuing focus on those areas? Do you see anything else kind of bubbling up that may draw some attention from Blue Dragon?
We've got our plans underway to open up in some new provinces.
Mm.
So Blue Dragon has mostly been working in the north, as well as Hue, which is a bit more central.
Mm.
We're starting up in the north central province of Nghệ An. Now, Nghệ An is kind of famous or notorious for its citizens traveling abroad, um, often being smuggled, paying people
Yep.
smugglers to get them to Europe and the UK, but then ending up in trafficking situations. But people from Nghệ An are also highly vulnerable to being trafficked regionally, so
Mm.
into Myanmar and Cambodia, for example. And that issue gets a lot less attention, but numerically it's a much more significant issue. So these are mostly ethnic minority people up in the mountains, in the border areas, and they've received a lot less support. So we're starting there now. We already have a few things going there, where we've got, as I speak to you, Mike, we've got the ball rolling with Ho Chi Minh City. There's a lot of processes for NGOs to go through to get
Sure.
permission,
Mhm.
and to bring on government partners in this work. But that's underway, and we're really excited about that, because we see a real possibility to help a lot of people there in the city. And then later in the year, we'll be starting something in Bakliyou province. And the expression I just used, starting something, is about all the detail I have at the moment.
Okay, that's fair.
But it's underway,
Okay.
because we've done quite a few rescues of people from Bakliyou
Mm.
province, and we've worked a lot with the authorities there on the prosecution of traffickers. So again, and this is always the good news story for Vietnam, that there is so much will to stop human trafficking.
Mhm.
It's not hard as an NGO to reach out to a provincial government, for example, and offer some help and find a warm response. So that's what we're doing for this year, while answering these calls for help as they come in. And if we get on another call in December, who knows what the story will be then? Because this
Yeah.
unfolds and changes so quickly.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's endlessly, disturbing, obviously, but fascinating and important to talk about. And also for listeners, I'll add about Nyan, I'll add a bit of context so that many of you may remember in 2019, the tragedy in Essex, where it was about 30 Vietnamese were found dead in a shipping container in the UK, and the majority of them came from Nyan province. So yeah, it has unfortunately kind of a history of, as you said, Michael, people looking overseas. Again, there's a difference between smuggling and trafficking, but they can be a bit fluid at times, I suppose.
That's right. That's right. And with all human trafficking in and from Vietnam, so much of it is people looking for opportunity, which is a good thing, right? If someone is sitting at home poor and hungry,
Mm-hmm.
you would say to them, "Well, go out and look for a job. Go where the jobs are." People are doing that,
Mm-hmm.
and then they're ending up in trouble, whether it's in a refrigerated container in Essex or traveling to Myanmar. So this is where people are vulnerable because they want to make their lives better.
Yeah.
We need to make sure people can make their life better
Mm-hmm.
safely.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I mean, on that note, closing note, how can people help Blue Dragon, help these people?
Well, head on to our website, bluedragon.org, and we're all over social media,
Mm.
so you should be able to find us. Um, we always welcome donations for our work, of course. As we expand, we're looking for partnerships, for companies that want to get involved, for schools that want to learn more about this. And we share as much as we can. So we're not only asking, but we love to share what we're learning, what we're seeing, so that others can use this information or can be inspired by it to start their own actions. So I do encourage people, look for us online, reach out to us.
Yeah, and I'll be sure to include those links in the show notes as well. And yeah, I mean, recommend signing up to Blue Dragon's newsletter as well. It's insightful and transparent as you can be.
Yeah, thank you. We try to be.
Hmm. Well, anyway, Michael, thanks again. I know these are very heavy subjects, but undeniably important. So thanks again for coming on the podcast.
Thanks, Mike. Always happy to talk.
That's it for today's episode. Please follow or subscribe to the Vietnam Weekly podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you find podcasts. I'll be back in your feed in 2 weeks.